Mr. Phileas Fogg asked if it was not too late to notify the Reverend Samuel Wilson of Marylebone Parish that evening. Passepartout smiled his most genial smile and said, "Never too late." It was 5 minutes to 8. "Will it be for tomorrow, Monday?" "For tomorrow, Monday," said Mr. Fogg. Passepartout hurried off as fast as his legs could carry him.
Talk Genealogy, the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands. Here's your presenter, Malcolm Noble.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being there, and welcome to episode 20 of the Talk Genealogy podcast, the monthly podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands. Passepartout's mission in the closing chapters of Around the World in 80 Days was to secure a marriage license. The likes of Phileas Fogg did not bother with the reading of the banns, and that's our subject tonight, the marriage licenses of Old England. Thank you for all your comments. Hey, come on. Some of you have been saying that the last few episodes have been a little self-indulgent with the profiles of William Phillimore, Sydenham Hervey, and a look at the descent from Magna Carta. Isn't it time for a good and detailed discussion of another source for family historians? Well, you know, you're right. I had a look round and I came up with marriage licenses. I thought, now they are a source that very often don't get too much of a mention. So here we go with episode 20, the marriage licenses of Old England. But first, I need to remind you that I am neither a professional nor an expert. I'm an enthusiast like you who has spent more than 50 years digging up his family tree, often in the wrong place. And these podcasts are really no more than me sharing with you some of the lessons that I've learned along the way. And I need to emphasise that I'm talking about ancestor hunting in England. And you can buy a copy of those transcripts on CD from the Cambridgeshire Family History Society. I'll pop a link on the website. In fact, there's been so much interesting material that I've had to leave out of tonight's podcast, really it wasn't relevant, that I can promise you a bumper edition, all to do with marriage, before too long.
Malcolm Noble, building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Now, since this episode is about marriages, and sometimes the shadier sides of marriage, I want to recall episode 10 of these podcasts, where I spoke about the work of J.S. Byrne, and in that talk I gave a few minutes to Byrne's work on fleet marriages. You may want to go back and listen again to that section, as it sort of plays into tonight's discussion. Certainly the two episodes share some of the same issues. So what's a marriage licence? Well, if you couldn't be doing with having your banns read in church for 3 Sundays before your marriage, or even worse, in the parish marketplace on 3 consecutive market days, you could apply for a marriage licence. These were issued by the ecclesiastical courts, usually on the authority of the archdeacon, but delegated to lower levels. It's a little more complicated than that, and we will dig into the detail later. There were 2 kinds: a common licence, when the wedding was to take place in the local parishes, and a special licence which allowed a marriage to take place in any church, but these could only be granted by the archbishop. A licence, of course, does not mean that the marriage actually took place. It is merely a record that permission had been given. The groom usually swore an oath or affidavit that there was nothing illegal about the proposed marriage, and the guarantor or bondsman put up a bond. Now, from the start, we begin to sense the opportunity for some fishiness here, and that suggests that the marriage licenses are a good hunting ground for the family tree detective. You can see that marriage licenses are particularly useful if you cannot locate the place of the marriage, if it's likely to be in a stranger's parish or somehow concealed from the prying eyes of family historians. Now, before we go any further, let's settle a few terms. The statement given by the groom that he intended to marry and that there was no reason why he shouldn't, is called the allegation. In the case of an allegation being made in the Archdeacon's Court, or before a surrogate, please, we will go into detail, the written allegation was forwarded to the appropriate registrar for the diocese for filing. The agreement to stand surety is the bond. The licence that was written was the written authority to proceed. In some ecclesiastical courts, information from the allegation and the bond was entered in a separate marriage licence register or act book. So with different unattached documents, we should not be surprised that many have come to be separated or lost, or they crop up in different places. You can see that there might be many reasons why a couple would seek a licence, but probably the most common reason was simple snobbery. As Thomas Blagg pointed out in his introduction to the Phillimore transcript of the Nottinghamshire licences, he said, towards the end of the 18th century and throughout the first half of the 19th, until the influence of the Oxford movement permeated the middle classes, marriage by licence was considered more respectable than by banns, and certainly snobbery explains why nearly all of those yeomen and better class tradesmen, as well as the gentry in this period, may be looked for in the records such as these, which are consequently invaluable to genealogical and biographical research. And that was Thomas Blagg writing. Perhaps the family had been married by licence for generations. It was the way they did things. Having the banns read might be a romantic celebration, but it could also be like washing dirty linen in public, especially if the servants were in the congregation. Wasn't it more appropriate for such classes to learn of the family's intention, well, all in our good time? In simpler cases, it may be that the groom was about to disappear on military service, or perhaps he had been offered employment that stipulated a married couple. But perhaps the couple were marrying without the family knowledge, without their good wishes or consent. In many cases, the bride-to-be was pregnant. In Old England, the conventions for marriage were, at best, hazy and open to abuse. Gradually, the church began to promulgate its own laws, but this helped little because the discretion of the church was always flexible. The church authority introduced bans of marriage in 1215, the year of the Magna Carta. Public notice was read of a forthcoming marriage in the couple's parish church for the 3 Sundays prior to the wedding, and this called for any objections to the proposed marriage. Even at this stage, a failure to call bans did not mean that the wedding was unlawful. In the 1300s, we find marriage licenses being issued to circumvent the requirement. After all, what's the point of having a rule if you can't find a way round it? One reason for objection might be the age of the couple. In very old times, generally, puberty decided marriageable age, and that was taken to be 14 for a boy and 12 for a girl. For a short period during the Commonwealth, this was raised to 16 and 14 with the parents' consent. However, with the restoration of the monarchy, the ages were reinstated as 14 and 12, but that requirement for parental consent remained. Hardwicke's Marriage Act, tabled in 1753 and coming into law in 1754, set down that parental consent was required until the age of 21. It was reduced to 18 in 1970. By the way, it wasn't until 1929 that marriageable age was raised to 16. Even so, records show us that as far back as medieval times, the early or middle 20s was the most popular age for marriage. Although while putting the script together for this episode, I did come across the marriage of a 14-year-old girl in Nottinghamshire as late as 1759. Another reason why the local know-it-alls might raise an objection when the bans were read was possible family relationships already existing between the intended bride and her groom. Now, This is taken from the Common Prayer Book of 1662. It has been altered on different occasions since, but here's a flavour. A woman may not marry her sister's daughter's husband, brother's daughter's husband, husband's brother's son, son's daughter's husband, daughter's daughter's husband, husband's son's son, father's sister's husband, husband's sister's son, husband's mother's brother, daughter's husband's brother, husband's daughter's son, father's brother, mother's sister's husband, husband's father's brother, husband's father's son, husband's son, husband's brother, sister's husband, son's son, daughter's son, brother's son, sister's son, grandfather, grandmother's husband, husband's grandfather, stepfather, father. This was amended by the Marriage Acts of 1907, 1931, and again in 1949. You may want to check your family tree. When seeking a license, you would need someone to stand surety, setting a bond that the marriage was lawful. This warranty varied through the ages, but could be about £200. This was often a family member or employer, sometimes a parish official, but it could also be a professional bondsman. Look out for the same name reoccurring again and again as the bondsman. You may also suspect a completely fictitious bondsman, usually with the surname Doe or rhyming with Doe, John Doe being the most obvious choice. Now this may seem strange because if you use the accepted fictitious name there would seem to be little intent to deceive anybody, but it was a way of the requirement of the license being circumvented if the issuing authority was satisfied that all was in good faith. If you're thinking that all of this is open to just a little abuse, you are right. Here is part of a letter from 1750 weighing the evidence that 3 parish officials, or surrogates, in Cambridgeshire had not been so responsible as they should have been when it came to issuing licenses.
I am much concerned at the account you gave of some of the surrogates. The evil of clandestine marriages has been long and loudly complained of, and imputed in a good measure, and indeed with too much reason, to those entrusted with licenses. Some must be left in the hands of particular clergymen, in confidence of their integrity and the regard they ought to have for their own character in granting them, for there can't be too much care taken in the affair of so tender a nature, where the peace and welfare of family is so much concerned. These great irregularities will one day ruin the ecclesiastical jurisdiction. As to the person you mention, they appear to have been guilty, that I can't think them at all proper to be any longer trusted, and therefore beg your Lord Higgins to let them know this, and to require them a return of the licenses undispatched in their hands, and to let them have no more. I am sure both you and Mr. Green will concur in any method to put a stop to these scandalous practices. I say, dear, this cheese is rather superb.
We know from our discussion of the Fleet marriages that by the mid-18th century there was a general acceptance that something had to be done about all this, and that thing was the Hardwicke's Marriage Act of 1854. This brought the church rules into regular law. The callings of banns in church or the obtaining of a licence was required by law. The Marriage Act did a lot of other things as well, but they are for another episode. And of course it was in July 1837 that civil marriages were introduced as an alternative to church marriages. Now let's have 20 seconds of music before we look at where the records might be found and how we can use them. Can I remind you that the show notes for this and previous episodes can be found on the website talkgenealogy.blog. That website includes a full bibliography of all the books mentioned in the series and of course a complete listing of the episodes.
Here's some earlier episodes of the podcast. Episode 15. Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Episode 13 was about the hearth tax. Episode 12, and it was Shakespeare, for example. Episode 9 discussed the medieval pipe rolls. Go to episode 7 for the companions of William the Conqueror. Episode 2, the Herald's Visitations, and our very first episode looked at working with Tudor wills. Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Okay, I'm posting this episode on the 3rd of March 2018. If you were listening a year ago, March 2017, we'd have been talking about the work of Edmund Burke and his book, The Vicissitudes of Families. Let's just listen in to a snippet from that episode. Here, he is telling us about wills and admins. But listen to how he brings it alive at the end of this passage. He writes, "Made at a solemn and impressive moment, and with a feeling of sanctity of the instrument, they are scarcely ever inaccurate or false, and in perusing their details, we seem to hear again the voice and the words of the departed, telling his own story and referring to facts of other times, with all the truth and certainty which personal knowledge can impart." And if you want more, then you'll find a link on the episode page of my website, talkgenealogy.blog.
Malcolm Noble, building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Tonight, the marriage licenses of Old England. To identify the issue in court, you need to go up the church hierarchy until the bride and groom come under the same authority. So, for a couple living in the same archdeaconry, it would be the archdeaconry court. For different archdeaconries, the consistory court would offer a bishop's license. And for different dioceses in the same province, the license will be issued by either York or Canterbury, with the Archbishop of Canterbury having the ultimate authority to issue licenses between the provinces or even at his own discretion. Now, just to explain some other terms, the Vicar General licence is for parishes from different dioceses, and the Faculty Office licence is from parishes in different provinces. In the old days, a researcher would need to establish where those ecclesiastical records are held, and they're kept in the records office of the diocese. But to say that is less than helpful, because you still need to find them. The records office of the diocese may well have been combined with a county records office, or it may be in a university library, especially if they are linked to ecclesiastical property. Or they could be still kept at the Minster itself. The County Records Office, the County Family History Society, or the Society of Genealogists should be able to point you in the right direction. But I'm afraid things are not going to be so straightforward. The documents may not be in a single archive, may not be even in one particular bundle, and nowhere can you be sure that you've found all that exist. Now, I have acknowledged the Cambridge Family History Society's transcripts of marriage licenses for their county. Now, their case illustrates the imaginative approach needed when tracking down these sources. The majority of the documents, in this case, i.e. the marriage license registers, the bonds and allegations, were found at Cambridge University Library. The compilers went to the Cambridge University Heraldic Society, the Northampton Records Office for the Peterborough Diocese, the Bodleian Library, Jesus College, Cambridge, Cambridge Records Office, and Ely House, Holborn, which is the London residence of the Bishop of Ely. They also recorded the gaps where no bonds or allegations survive. So there was no registers between 1620 and 1659, 1662 and 1686, and no allegations for 1835. Again, no bonds or allegations from 1789 to 1790, 1799 to 1801, and 1835. Now again, we are only talking about Cambridgeshire as an example, but I hope it's getting you to understand what you're likely to find and what's likely to be difficult. But in spite of all this gloom, marriage licenses are well worth looking for, and so I'm sure you'll agree an important early step is to check whether the Register of Licenses has been transcribed and published. Phillimore is the most obvious option, or increasingly again the County Family History Society. The librarian at the Society of Genealogists will be able to let you know what transcripts are available and where they are. Now, the entries that you'll find will be brief, but nevertheless they can be more informative than the marriage registers in the parish. They often give the ages of the bride and groom, their marital status, and most helpfully their occupation. They will often state the social status of the individuals, yeoman or gentleman. So you can see that especially before 1760, the record of the licence can be more helpful than the marriage register, although of course this does vary from register to register. It is because of this extra information that I always check for the marriage licences. You never know what you're going to find, and of course it is corroboration, well, up to a point. Because they cover the ecclesiastical boundaries of several parishes or even dioceses, they can be especially productive in tracking down or even revealing strays. Also, they tend to go back beyond the start of the parish registers, although it is patchy. So why did your ancestor resort to a license? If the entry does not reveal the secret, you will need to look elsewhere for clues, making it a good opportunity to re-examine your family tree. Oh yes, we're talking about collateral lines again. And maybe you need to go to one or two new sources. Let's look to see where you get to. Pulling out just one example, it's 1812 and the Register for Licenses records the case of Alice Smith, aged 17. Simon Goodman and John Aveling are listed as Alice's guardians. Interesting. Furthermore, one of the guardians is listed as a yeoman, the other is not. So there's plenty to unpack even in that one simple entry. Now, probably the most famous example of a marriage licence solving a wedding puzzle is the William Shakespeare's licence to marry Anne Hathaway. Historians have been unable to find the marriage of William and Anne. It certainly didn't take place in Stratford. But there is a record of a licence being issued in Worcestershire in November 1582. Problem solved. Well, not quite. The record mentions the wrong Anne, and this has led to some controversy about whether there were two women in William's life. It is more likely to have been a simple mistake. We can see that the cleric was prone to scribbling errors. I've said more about this in episode 12 of this podcast, Take Shakespeare for example, and you may want to go back and look at that. Some people have argued that in this case a licence was preferred because Anne Hathaway was already heavily pregnant. I favour a more likely explanation lying in the religious background of the Shakespeares. Both the Shakespeares and the Ardens were committed Catholics at this time, and it may be that William wanted to be married away from Stratford by a clergyman sympathetic to Catholic belief. That might be one aspect that you could look at. Through Tudor and early Stuart times, the flavour of your ancestors' religion may be relevant, old religion or new. Remember, a good way to get a handle on this is the preamble to any family will. See episode 1 of our podcast for how to work with Tudor wills. I've said that snobbery was a common motivation in choosing to marry by licence. So now let's look at status. Oh yes, I'm going to talk about social profile again. You know I always do this whenever I get a chance. Look to see if other members of the family married by license or after the reading of banns, and look on both sides of the family. Is anyone marrying up or marrying down? Is there anything to suggest that the marriage might have met with some resistance or eyebrow raising in the parish or within the family? Now, it's very difficult to impose opinions on our forefathers, but if we broaden our search, it is likely to increase our understanding of possible issues, relationships, coincidences and curiosities, even if you cannot say that any were reasons for avoiding marriage banns. Also, look at the time of year. People avoided getting married from Advent to mid-January or during Lent, again, especially through Tudor times. And if the birth of the child was due during these periods, a hurried marriage before those seasons may not be so much a shotgun wedding as a simple avoidance of bastardy. Here's a folk rhyme that sets out the prohibitions. Advent marriage doth thee deny, but Hilary gives thee liberty. Septuagint says thee nay, 8 days from Easter says you may. Rogation bids thee to contain, but Trinity sets you free again. And to leave on a humorous note, I first heard about marriage licenses when I was a youngish teenager, already feeling my way through a very rudimentary genealogy. I asked my grandmother if she'd been married by license, and she assured me that she hadn't. She had been married properly. She then went on to explain about being churched after childbirth. Thank you for listening to episode 20 of the Talk Genealogy podcast. Please do get in touch if you have any thoughts or comments. Can I remind you that the show notes for tonight's episode can be found on talkgenealogy.blog. The next episode will be posted at 7:30 p.m. UK time on the 3rd of April. You can also follow me on Twitter. Look for the hashtag TalkGenealogy. You know, I've really enjoyed putting together tonight's episode, and I'm determined to sort out a bumper episode on everything to do with marriage. Let's see how long that takes me. My thanks to Freeze Effects for the music, Emily Brooks for the voiceover, and thank you for listening. Good night, and God bless.